I will break you completely, Mountain Man snarled at his weeping fat wife, his hidden intention. I will break you completely. The words fell cold and sharp against the sterile air of Healing Ridge, echoing off the tiled walls like a gavel striking doom. Cordelia Cora Ashworth flinched. Her hands, pale and trembling, clutched the edges of the hospital blanket. The thin fabric could not protect her from the weight of those words, or from the man who had spoken them. Dr. Matthias, Matt Soul Healer, stood before her, tall and still, his white coat spotless against the dim light. He was a man rumored to fix shattered minds by any means necessary. His patients called him ruthless. His colleagues called him brilliant. To Cora, he looked like both executioner and savior in one form. I already am broken, she whispered, voice trembling like a cracked bell. There's nothing left to destroy. Her words would have ended any other session, but Matt didn't flinch. He took a single step forward, measured, deliberate, and crouched until his eyes met hers. You're wrong, he said quietly, with the calm certainty of someone who had seen despair before and refused to fear it. You built walls to survive. I will break them. Every lie, every self-blame, every chain you forged around yourself. And when I'm done, you'll finally breathe again. Cora's tears came fast, silent, uncontrollable. She thought she had met cruelty. She didn't yet understand that this kind of breaking wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to heal. Outside, the wind screamed against the glass. Inside, a different kind of storm was beginning, the kind that stripped souls bare and built them anew. And so began the marriage that wasn't born from love or choice, but from the desperate hope that a man of unflinching discipline could save a woman who had forgotten how to live. Before the world knew her as Doctor. Soul Healer's wife, Cordelia Ashworth, had been the quiet girl no one noticed, except when they wanted to mock her. In the city, she had been called names whispered behind polite smiles. Too soft, too heavy, too fragile to survive. What no one saw was the slow drowning happening behind her calm eyes, the sleepless nights, the untouched meals, the weight of her own thoughts pressing like stone against her chest. When she was 21, she left a note on her kitchen table. 6 words written in delicate script. I'm sorry, I can't do this. Then she drove to the cliffs. It should have ended there, but fate sent her a stranger that night, a man with storm-gray eyes and a steady voice that cut through the wind. Dr. Matthias Soul Healer had been returning from a medical conference when he saw her silhouette on the edge. He didn't shout, didn't plead. He simply said, if you step forward, it won't end the pain. It will pass it on to someone else. Let me carry it for a while. Something in his tone, the discipline, the quiet authority, made her stop. 3 months later, she woke not in a hospital ward, but in a rehabilitation wing overlooking a forest of endless green. The world outside was silent except for the hum of wind and birds. Healing Ridge, he called it, his private center for those the world had already given up on. And she had been his most difficult case. She refused therapy, refused food, refused light. She told him she didn't deserve to get better. He disagreed. I don't treat lost causes, he told her during one of their first sessions. Only those brave enough to face themselves. When her family, exhausted and afraid, learned that Matthias had prevented her death, they made an unexpected proposal. If he could save her permanently, not just medically, but emotionally, they would grant him guardianship. In the eyes of the law, it meant one thing: Marriage. The papers were signed without romance, only necessity. The town called it madness. The reclusive doctor marrying the broken girl he had saved. But up on the mountain, away from the gossip and pity, it became something else. Cora lived in a quiet room at the far end of the main lodge. Every morning at 6, she heard the doctor's footsteps in the hallway, precise, measured, never rushed. He spoke little during the day, but his presence filled every space like gravity. He never shouted. He never pitied her. He simply observed, like a soldier studying an enemy line before battle. At night, he stayed in his office, writing notes about her progress by the glow of a single lamp. To others, it might have looked like obsession, but in truth, it was faith. Faith that the girl he had pulled from the edge of death still had something worth saving. And though she didn't yet believe it, Cora was about to discover that every rule he imposed, every challenge he set, every wall he promised to break, was never meant to control her. It was meant to lead her back to herself. The first morning on Healing Ridge felt like punishment. The air was too sharp, the silence too deep, the doctor too watchful. Cora sat by the window, wrapped in a heavy blanket, staring at the wilderness below. Somewhere deep inside, she wanted to disappear into that endless white. Dr. Matthias, soul healer, entered without a word. His presence filled the room like a quiet storm. He placed a tray on the table, oats, berries, tea, and a folded paper. "What's this?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Your first assignment," he replied. "Eat everything, then write 10 things you hate about yourself." Her eyes widened. "Why?" He didn't look up from his notes. "Because to rebuild, we start with what's been poisoned." She wanted to argue, to tell him it was cruel, but his tone left no room for rebellion. When he left, she forced herself to chew each bite, bitterness clinging to her tongue. Then she took the pen and wrote, "Fat, useless, weak, broken, unlovable." When she reached 10, her hand trembled. Tears fell onto the page, smearing the ink. That night, he read her list silently in front of the fireplace. The crackling wood filled the long, unbearable pause. Then, with calm precision, he tore the paper in half. "Good," he said. "Now you know your enemies. Tomorrow we'll start destroying them." And he did. Every day on the mountain became a ritual of dismantling. At dawn, he made her walk through the pine forest barefoot, to remind her that pain could exist without punishment. At noon, he taught her how to cook simple meals, forcing her to face the food she once used to harm herself. At dusk, he made her talk about her father's coldness, her mother's silence, her own belief that she wasn't enough. She resisted at first. She screamed. She cried. Once, she threw a plate at the wall and told him she hated him. He didn't flinch. "Good," he said again. "Hatred means you're alive." Weeks turned to months. The mountain became her mirror, unforgiving, yet cleansing. Slowly, she began to feel her body again, not as something to be punished, but as something that still belonged to her. The walks grew longer. The food no longer felt like guilt. The nights grew quieter inside her head. One evening, during a storm, the power went out. The mountain roared outside, and the only light came from the fire in the main hall. Cora found Matt there, his coat off, sleeves rolled up, splitting wood by hand. For the first time, she saw not the cold doctor, but the man, weary, disciplined, but not unfeeling. "Do you ever rest?" she asked softly. He paused, breath fogging in the firelight. "Resting is for those who've finished their work." "And you haven't," He shook his head. Not until you stop looking at yourself like a crime that needs to be punished. Her throat tightened. You think that's possible? He looked up at her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. I don't think. I know. That night, as the storm raged outside, she felt something shift, small but irreversible. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of dying. She dreamed of climbing. From that night on, every therapy session was a climb. Up the mountain, up from despair, up toward the light that had always waited for her. By the time the snow began to thaw on Healing Ridge, the rhythm of life between Cora and Matt had changed. The house no longer felt like a clinic. The air smelled less of antiseptic and more of cinnamon and firewood. The mountain, once a silent witness to her despair, now echoed with the sound of her steps each morning as she followed him into the woods. Their sessions no longer looked like therapy. They looked like life. In the mornings, he made her chop wood, an act that frustrated her at first. What does this have to do with healing? She'd complained, gripping the axe awkwardly. Control, he answered simply. You've been surrendering to pain for so long, you've forgotten how to command it. She swung, missed, cursed, tried again and again, until one day the log split cleanly in two. Matt said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted. That half-smile stayed with her longer than any session. At noon, they cooked together in the kitchen that overlooked the valley. Matt, ever methodical, measured every ingredient with precision, while Cora stirred, tasting as she went. The meals became her medicine, the process itself a reminder that nourishment wasn't shameful. Once she laughed, a sound that startled them both. He looked up from his notebook, expression unreadable, then turned back to his work, pretending not to notice the warmth spreading between them. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. She would read aloud from the books he chose, poems about loss, renewal, and hope. He never interrupted, just listened, eyes half closed, as though the sound of her voice was part of his own healing. One night, as the flames flickered low, she dared to ask, "Why do you live up here alone, Doctor?" He stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "Because silence tells the truth faster than people do." She understood more than she wanted to admit. Silence had once been her prison too, but now, in his presence, it felt different, safer, warmer. Slowly, the boundaries of doctor and patient began to blur, not out of rebellion, but out of shared humanity. She stopped calling him doctor. He stopped writing notes about her progress. They began to talk like equals about art, war, loneliness, and the strange fragility of the human mind. When nightmares came, as they often did, she would wake in panic, trembling, gasping for air. He would appear within moments, never touching her, never speaking at first, just sitting nearby, breathing slowly until her breaths matched his. Then softly, "You're safe. The mountain doesn't hurt anyone who wants to live." Sometimes she would fall asleep again to the sound of his steady breathing beside the fire. Days turned to weeks, and she began to move through the cabin as though it were hers. She cleaned, tended the small garden behind the house, and even nursed an injured bird back to health. When she released it into the sky, Matt watched from the porch. "It won't come back," she said quietly. He shook his head. "It doesn't have to. It remembers it can fly." She looked at him, the meaning sinking in, and whispered, "So do I." That night, as they shared soup in silence, she realized she wasn't afraid of being broken anymore. What terrified her now was what came next, learning how to live without hiding behind her pain. And Matt, who had promised to break her, was the only one she trusted to show her how. Spring melted the snow on Healing Ridge, but with the thaw came something darker. Cora began to sense it first, in the way Matt grew quieter, more withdrawn. He would leave early, returning long after dusk, his coat dusted with ash, his eyes fixed on something distant. One evening, as the storm clouds gathered over the mountains, she found him in the cellar beneath the main hall, a place he'd forbidden her to enter. The room smelled of iron and damp wood. On the table lay stacks of old medical files bound in faded leather. She picked one up. Her name was written on the cover. Inside she found notes, clinical, methodical, about her despair, her weight, her self-hatred. But there were others too. Case Chia 47, Hannah Voss, severe trauma, suicide during Phase 3. Her heart stopped. There were dozens more. When Matt entered, the look on his face was not anger, but weariness. "You weren't supposed to see that yet," he said quietly. "You told me I wasn't the first patient," she whispered, trembling, "but you didn't tell me what happened to them." He exhaled slowly. "Most didn't make it." She stared at him, horror and disbelief twisting inside her. "You experimented on them?" "No," he said firmly, stepping closer. "I tried to save them, but I didn't understand then what I do now." Cora shook her head, tears streaking down her face. "What changed?" He looked at her as if the answer were obvious. "You!" But the damage was done. That night, she packed her things. "You said you'd break me to heal me," she said, voice cracking, "but maybe you were just breaking people until someone finally survived." Matt didn't stop her. He simply said, "If you leave now, everything we built will collapse. The woman you've become will vanish back into the one who wanted to die." She froze at the door. His words weren't a threat. They were the truth. Still, she left. For days, she stayed at a small inn at the base of the mountain, the valley loud and bright after months of quiet. People smiled at her, but it all felt wrong. Food tasted empty. The world seemed too noisy, too careless. Then the news came. Dr. Matthias, soul healer, was under investigation. The medical board had received an anonymous complaint accusing him of using unethical treatment methods and exploiting vulnerable patients. Cora knew instantly who had filed it. The same old colleagues who had mocked him for daring to treat the unfixable. But she also knew he wouldn't defend himself. He'd rather be condemned than justify himself. That night, she returned to the mountain. When she entered the lodge, she found him by the fireplace, the light flickering across his face. He looked older, tired, as though the fire had been burning him instead of warming him. "Why didn't you fight back?" she asked. "Because they're not wrong," he said softly. "I did cross a line. I loved a patient." The confession hit her like thunder. He stood, meeting her eyes. "But I'd rather lose my license than pretend it was only therapy. You taught me that healing isn't about control, it's about surrender." Tears blurred her vision. "Then what now?" He smiled, faint, sad, resolute. "Now it's your turn to save me." The hearing was held in the Capitol, a place of polished marble, sharp suits, and colder hearts. To the medical board, Dr. Matthias, soul healer, was no longer a healer, but a heretic. The charges were grave: psychological manipulation, unethical treatment, and emotional entanglement with a patient. The audience whispered like a pack of vultures waiting for blood. Cora stood in the back, her heart pounding. Matt sat alone at the long table, hands folded, eyes steady. He refused to defend himself. Every accusation landed like a stone, but he didn't flinch. To him, the punishment didn't matter. Only the truth did. When the board called for witnesses, Cora rose. "Cordelia Ashworth," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. The room turned toward her. The girl once declared incurable, now standing tall and unbroken. "You are one of his patients," the chairman said coldly. "Do you wish to testify against Dr. Soul Healer?" "I wish to testify for him," she replied. Gasps rippled through the hall. Cora stepped closer, her voice trembling but fierce. "When he said he would break me, everyone assumed he meant destroy me. But what he broke were the lies I told myself, that I was worthless, hopeless, better off dead. He didn't save me from pain. He saved me through it. He didn't control me. He taught me how to control myself." The chairman frowned. "Miss Ashworth, this man violated ethical boundaries." She cut him off. "If loving his patients is a crime, then he's guilty. But love was the medicine the rest of you were too afraid to prescribe." The silence that followed was suffocating. Matt's eyes found hers, shimmering with something he rarely allowed himself to show. Hope. "I was supposed to die," Cora said softly. "Instead, I stand before you alive, healed, and helping others do the same. If that's wrong, then perhaps your ethics need healing, not him." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, one of the board members, an older woman with silver hair, cleared her throat. "Dismiss the charges," she said. "A doctor who restores life doesn't deserve punishment." The gavel struck once. The case was closed. Outside, as the sun dipped below the mountains, Matt stepped beside her. He didn't speak, but when she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. "You told me you'd break me," she whispered. "You did, and I'll never stop thanking you for it." Months passed, and the snow returned to Healing Ridge, but this time it no longer felt like isolation. It felt like home. The old clinic had changed. Gone were the cold wards and locked rooms. In their place stood sunlit spaces filled with warmth, books, laughter, and life. Patients came not as subjects to be studied, but as souls to be heard. And at the center of it all were Cora and Matt, side by side, not doctor and patient, but partners in purpose. Cora had opened her own wing, the Renewal House, a sanctuary for those recovering from depression and self-harm. She used the same methods that once saved her, walking in silence, sharing meals, rediscovering the simple rhythm of being alive. And every night, when she led her group in meditation, she would glance toward the doorway, where Matt always stood quietly, arms folded, watching with quiet pride. Sometimes he'd still tease her gently. "You've stolen all my patience," he'd say. "And you finally learned to rest," she'd answer. Their love wasn't dramatic or loud. It was built in small gestures, the way he'd pour her tea before she asked, the way she'd leave notes on his desk reminding him to breathe. They'd both been broken once, but now their scars no longer frightened them. They were proof. One evening, as dusk painted the sky over the ridge, Cora whispered, "You didn't just break me, Matt. You rebuilt me into someone who can do the same for others." He brushed his thumb against her hand. "No," he said softly. "You rebuilt yourself. I just handed you the hammer." Every time I tell this story, I think of how healing is never gentle. It's a breaking, a tearing down of everything false until only truth remains. Cora thought she had to die to escape her pain, but she learned that rebirth only begins when someone dares to stay. Wherever you're listening from, mountain cabin or city street, remember this: being broken doesn't mean being beyond repair. Sometimes the ones who shatter us are the ones who set us free. If you still believe love can rebuild what pain once destroyed, stay a little longer. The next story is for you.